The debris field wasn't the problem. Fleet Commander Vethal had processed debris fields before, after Corundal, after the siege of Morn Station, after 17 other engagements where lesser species had scattered their ships like broken teeth across the void. Debris was expected. Debris meant resolution. What stopped her was the silence from Grid Sector 9. Not the silence of empty space. The silence of something that had been transmitting 30 seconds ago and simply wasn't anymore. No explosion signature. No cascade failure. No distress beacon cutting off mid-sequence. The probe had been there and then it produced a single untranslatable data packet and then it was gone. The packet sat in her queue, unopened, flagged by the system as containing no known linguistic structure. Vethal stared at it for 4 full seconds, an eternity for a commander of her processing speed. Then she opened a channel to her second. Row 7. Pull up everything we have on human debris field behavior. Commander. Everything starting now. 3 weeks earlier, the encirclement had been considered the cleanest military operation the Sovereignty had executed in 200 cycles. 47 vessels. 1 inhabited system. 1 species that had achieved faster-than-light travel exactly 11 years prior. Barely enough time to stumble their way to 4 colony worlds before the Sovereignty's forward scouts made first contact. The humans had been given the standard offer: integration, resource allocation agreements, a seat on the peripheral council that carried exactly as much weight as the Sovereignty chose to grant it. Most species accepted within a single negotiation cycle. The math was simply too obvious to argue. Humanity had asked for time to consider. That was their first peculiarity. Every species granted thinking time used it to seek better terms, or to quietly panic, or to begin the cultural transformation required to accept permanent subordination. Human governments used their thinking time to do something the Sovereignty's intelligence apparatus had no category for. They went very, very quiet. Not panicked quiet, not defeated quiet. The communications that did come through, shipping manifests, routine colony supply requests, academic transmissions about stellar cartography, were aggressively normal. Suspiciously normal in a way that Vethal's intelligence officer, a meticulous analyst named Dosick, flagged 3 times before anyone listened. They're performing routine, Dosick had told her, aboard the command vessel Eternal Premise 6 weeks before the encirclement. Every transmission we intercept is exactly what a species without awareness of our surveillance would send. 2 exactly. You're saying they know we're watching. I'm saying the probability that a pre-integration species produces this distribution of communication content, with this degree of cross-colony coordination, without a single anomalous internal message about their political crisis. Dosick paused. It's not impossible. It is 1.7 standard deviations beyond what our models predict. Vethal had considered this. 1.7 isn't alarming. No, Dosick agreed, it isn't. She thought about that conversation a great deal later. The encirclement itself had been textbook. 47 vessels dropped from superluminal translation at calculated intervals around the boundary of the Sol system, creating an interlocking sensor net that made undetected departure physically impossible. The gravity anchor platforms deployed without incident. The signal dampening array, the Sovereignty's proprietary suppression technology, capable of reducing all outbound FTL communication to uselessness, went active on schedule. Earth was, by every measurable standard, trapped. The human governments had 12 hours to produce a formal surrender before the Sovereignty began demonstrating consequences on the outermost colony, a small settlement on a moon called Titan. 12 hours passed. No surrender came. Expected, Vethal had noted, marking it in her log. Psychological resistance phase, estimated duration, 4 to 11 days. What arrived instead at the 14-hour mark was a transmission from Earth's surface. Not a surrender, not a counteroffer. It was a single human voice, female, calm in a way that Dosick later described as climatically calm, the way a temperature is calm, not the way a person is calm. The voice said, in sovereignty standard, which no human should have been able to speak at that level of fluency, "We've been waiting for you to finish setting up. We have a proposal." That was the first time Vethal felt something she would not formally name in her logs, but which her species recognized as the sensation preceding the understanding that a situation was not what it appeared to be. She opened the channel. "You are in no position to propose anything." A brief pause, not hesitation, more like consideration of how to phrase something simply. "Fleet Commander Vethal, we know your name. We know the names of every vessel in your formation, their last 3 deployment locations, the rotation schedule of your crew cycles, and the technical specifications of your gravity anchor array." Another pause. "We've known you were coming for 8 months. The silence that followed in the command room of the asterisk eternal premise was of the second type, the one that meant something had gone wrong with the model. Dosick pulled up his anomaly flags. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Vethal kept her voice even. "If you've known, why didn't you flee? You had time to evacuate your colonies beyond our reach." The response was immediate this time, "Because we didn't want to flee." "Then you should have surrendered before the encirclement." "We didn't want to do that either." "What," Vethal said very carefully, "did you want?" The answer came after a pause that felt, to a commander trained in the mathematics of negotiation, precisely calculated to land at maximum psychological weight. "We wanted you exactly where you are." The channel closed. In the following 8 hours, nothing happened. This was the third peculiarity, following the suspicious quiet of the thinking period and the impossible knowledge of the fleet's composition. The Sovereignty ran full scans of the solar system. They confirmed human space vessels were present in their expected configuration. A handful of short-range military craft, atmospheric defense platforms of limited range, and the civilian shipping traffic one expected from a species 11 years into FTL capability. Nothing that could meaningfully threaten a Sovereignty battle group. The gravity anchors held, the signal suppression array held, the encirclement held. And yet, "Run it again," Vethal told her sensor officer. "Commander, the results will be." "Run it again." The results were the same. The encirclement was intact. The humans had no meaningful military force beyond the system's gravity well. They had no allies within response range. The Sovereignty had been meticulous about that, choosing this target specifically because it was isolated. 4 colony worlds, none of them mature enough to provide meaningful military support, all of them now within secondary fleet interdiction range. By any rational analysis, humanity was finished. Dosick appeared at Vethal's shoulder, which he only did when he was about to say something he'd already decided she wouldn't want to hear. "The untranslatable data packet," he said, "from Grid Sector 9, before the probe went silent. I saw it. I ran it through 17 translation matrices. It's not a language failure." He set his data slate on her console. "It's not language at all. It's a technical schematic." Vethal looked at it. The geometry was wrong in a way that took her 3 full seconds to articulate. Then she understood what she was looking at. "That's a gravity anchor," she said. "Yes. That's one of our asterisk gravity anchors." "Yes," Dosick said, "with modifications I cannot explain." The first misinterpretation had taken root 6 months before the fleet arrived, in a Sovereignty intelligence assessment that classified human military activity as compensatory posturing, meaning a species that knows it cannot win militarily, making visible shows of preparation to influence the negotiation terms. Every civilization did it. It was a predictable, rational response to an asymmetric power situation. The assessment was authored by 3 experienced analysts and reviewed by 2 senior commanders. It was the consensus interpretation of a genuine observation. Humanity was clearly doing something with military resources that it clearly could not afford, and doing it visibly enough that sovereignty surveillance would notice. They had noticed. They had classified it correctly in their framework. They had filed it and moved on. What they had missed, what their framework had no space for, was that the visibility was not an accident. The humans weren't posturing. They were showing the sovereignty exactly what they wanted it to see, in enough detail to be convincing, in enough volume to fill all available surveillance bandwidth. While the surveillance bandwidth was full, other things were happening in the places no one was watching. Vethal didn't know any of this yet. She was still looking at the schematic of her own gravity anchor, modified in ways her best technical officer would spend the next 6 hours failing to fully analyze, recovered from a probe that had gone silent in the empty space between Saturn and the system's heliopause, where there was nothing, had never been anything worth watching. The probe, she said, what killed it? Her technical officer, Marin 6, rotated a holographic display. Unknown, no weapon signature, the probe simply stopped functioning, all systems simultaneously. That's not possible. Our probes have redundant. I know what they have, Commander. Another silence. How many probes do we have in the outer system? Marin 6 checked. We deployed 19 to ensure full coverage of. She stopped, checked again. 17. We deployed 19. 17 are responding. In the 9 hours since the encirclement had been established, 2 probes had silently ceased to exist in the outer system, and the sovereignty had not noticed because 19 probes were more than sufficient coverage, and the data from the remaining 17 was exactly what it should be, and no one had reason to count. Count everything, Vethal said quietly. Every platform, every relay, every anchor, count all of it, and find me that human spokesperson. I want her back on this channel in 10 minutes. It took 12. The woman's voice, when it came through, sounded precisely as calm as before. Fleet Commander, you said you wanted us where we are. Explain that. I'd rather show you. Check your anchor in position 7. Vethal already had Marin 6 pulling the telemetry before she finished the sentence. Anchor 7 was in the outer system, past the asteroid belt, holding the far edge of the interdiction perimeter, one of the most critical positions in the formation, because losing it created a gap large enough for ships to escape through before the adjacent anchors could compensate. Anchor 7's telemetry was perfect, nominal power, nominal function, all systems operating within expected parameters. There's nothing wrong with Anchor 7, Vethal said. I know, the human voice said. Check who's operating it. This was the second misinterpretation, and it was of a different quality than the first. The first had been a failure of imagination. The sovereignty analysts had seen what humans were doing and slotted it into the nearest familiar category because no other category existed. This was something else. This was a failure that required understanding something fundamental about how humans approached a problem they couldn't solve directly. Anchor 7 was operating perfectly. Its power signatures were nominal. Its gravity field was stable. Its identification transponder was broadcasting the correct sovereignty codes on the correct frequency at the correct intervals. None of those things were being produced by sovereignty equipment. The anchor that the sovereignty had deployed in that position, Marin 6 found it 40 kilometers away, drifting, systems dark, deactivated so gently that it had produced no alert signature. In its place, producing a flawless imitation of its output down to the harmonic frequencies of the power coupling, was a human device. Not a reverse-engineered copy, not a rough approximation. A device that had been built with precise foreknowledge of what it needed to simulate, which meant it had been designed before the sovereignty fleet arrived, which meant humans had obtained detailed technical specifications for sovereignty gravity anchors before any sovereignty gravity anchor had ever entered this system. Marin 6 said, in a voice that had lost most of its professional inflection, "They built it to match what we deploy. They knew our exact equipment." "That's not all," Dosick said. He'd been running a quiet analysis for the past 4 minutes. "I've been looking at the anchor's simulated output. It's not just matching ours. There are signal structures embedded in the broadcast that our anchor would not produce." "What kind of structures?" "The kind," he said slowly, "that would interact with adjacent anchors in the network." He set down his slate. "Commander, I think the fake anchor is talking to our real anchors." No one in the command room spoke for a long moment. "We're not trying to break your formation," the human voice said, still on the open channel. She had been listening to all of it. "We don't need to. We just needed to add something to it." "What did you add?" Vethel asked, and she was aware with a precision that surprised her that she did not want to know the answer. "Access," the human said simply. Now the story became larger than it had appeared. Because access, that single word, delivered in that climatically calm voice, recontextualized everything the sovereignty had done for the past 8 months. Every intelligence assessment, every careful calculation of humanity's military capacity, every reassuring confirmation that the encirclement was proceeding nominally. The sovereignty had been building, for 8 months, under its own power, with its own equipment, a structure that humans had spent 8 months designing to be buildable in exactly that configuration. The 47 ships, the 19 probes, the 17 anchors, the signal suppression array. All of it placed, Vethal was beginning to understand exactly where humans needed it to be. She said very quietly, "How long have you been modifying our equipment?" "We started on the suppression array 6 hours after you deployed it. The anchors took longer. We wanted to make sure the modifications to all 17 were stable before we told you." "All 17? "Well, the 2 that went quiet in the outer system, we removed those entirely. You only have 15 real anchors in your formation now, but the sensor coverage from your 17 active transponders looks the same, so our formation has gaps we can't see." "Yes." Vethal's next question was tactical, professional, and completely wrong, which was itself a kind of measure of how far the situation had moved from her models. She asked, "What do you want? Withdrawal? New terms?" The pause this time was not calculated. It sounded, for the first time, like genuine human surprise. "No," the woman said. "Fleet Commander, you're still not understanding. We don't want you to leave. We want you to stay exactly where you are. We need about 18 more hours." "For what?" The channel closed again. What followed was not chaos. Chaos would have been a relief, because chaos was legible. What followed was 17 hours of perfect, nominal, unremarkable operation from every system in the sovereignty encirclement, during which Vethal and her senior staff discovered, piece by piece, that they had completely misunderstood the nature of the trap they were in. It was Dosick who found it, at the 11-hour mark. While running a backward analysis of every data transmission the signal suppression array had blocked since going active. "The array is working," he reported. "It has blocked all human FTL communications from leaving this system exactly as designed. Then, it has also," he continued, in the voice of someone describing a building they are standing in as it burns, "been receiving." The suppression array blocked outbound FTL signals. It did not, because no one had ever needed to design it this way, block inbound ones. Why would it? The purpose of a suppression array was to prevent the trapped species from calling for help. No one called for help into * a besieged system. Except that help was not what had been coming in. For 17 days before the Sovereignty fleet arrived, human FTL transmitters at the colony worlds, Transmitters the sovereignty had interdicted but not disabled, because disabling them required a separate order that no one had issued because no one had thought it mattered, had been transmitting packages into the Sol system. Through the suppression array that hadn't been built yet. Through the anchor network that hadn't been deployed yet. Into receiver stations that had been placed in the outer system, in the empty space where no one was watching, months in advance. They transmitted through infrastructure that didn't exist yet. Marin 6 said, "That's not." They transmitted at the coordinates where the infrastructure would exist, Dosick corrected, because they knew exactly where we would place it. The packages were still arriving. Vethal looked at the accumulation log. The volume was not large, not weapons, not troops, not anything that registered on mass sensors. The packages were informational, data, code, the kind of thing that weighed nothing and could be compressed to almost nothing and could, if it contained the right instructions, talk to 17 gravity anchors through a fake 18th anchor and do something to them that sovereignty engineering had never designed them to do. She opened the channel herself this time. She didn't wait for the human to respond. The packages your colonies have been transmitting, they're not messages. It wasn't a question. No, the human voice confirmed. They're the commands for what you've been building inside our network. Yes. What have you built? This pause was the longest yet. When the woman spoke again, something in her voice had changed. Not the temperature that remained constant, but the weight of it, as if she was choosing carefully how much to carry in the words. Something that doesn't have a name yet in your language. In ours, we call it a mirror. A mirror. You built a cage around us. We built the same cage using your cage around you. The difference is asterisk, and here the voice shifted in a way Vethal could not classify. Something between professional pride and a grief she didn't understand. We know where the door is. You don't. 6 hours later, the first sovereignty vessel attempted to leave. Not in panic. Vethal had authorized a controlled withdrawal of a single scout vessel to test the perimeter, to determine whether the human claims had substance. She had chosen her fastest ship. She had calculated 3 exit vectors with the highest probability of clean departure. She had given the order with the cold precision that had characterized her command of 17 engagements. The scout vessel accelerated toward the heliopause on Vector 1. It stopped. Not violently, not a collision, not a weapon impact, not a system failure. It stopped the way a hand stops when it presses against glass it didn't see. Deceleration clean enough to preserve crew safety. The ship simply could not proceed further. The pilot reported, in a tone of professional confusion that was becoming the dominant emotional register of this engagement. The space ahead registers as Commander. My instruments are reading what appears to be a gravity anchor field, but there is no anchor at these coordinates. There's a field without a source. There's a field consistent with a source. The source isn't there. Marin 6 made a sound that, in her species, indicated the moment when a working theory collapsed completely. The modifications to our network, they didn't just add access, they added output capacity. Output where? Everywhere. She expanded the holographic display. The gravity anchor network that the sovereignty had built, designed to prevent human ships from escaping, now showed secondary field projections. Not at the anchor positions, at the spaces between them, filling the gaps, sealing the formation from the inside. The 47 sovereignty vessels, the 15 real anchors, the 2 dead ones in the outer system, the fake 18th, all of it now formed a structure that was not what the sovereignty had built. We're inside our own cage, Vethal said. It was not a question. It was not even a statement of shock. It was the particular flatness of voice that emerges when someone understands something, and the understanding is large enough that emotion hasn't caught up to it yet. The human voice returned without being called. We didn't do this to destroy you. I want to be clear about that. Then what is this? Leverage, she said. The same leverage you brought to us. Your offer, integration, resource agreements, a seat at a council that means nothing. We couldn't refuse it openly. You had 47 ships, so we needed 47 ships. Vethal said nothing. She was thinking. We don't want your territory, the woman continued. We don't want your resources. We want the same thing you wanted from us, a negotiation, except now it's a real one. If we agree to negotiate, you release the formation. If we agree to terms, yes. And if we don't? The pause this time was short. Then we have 47 sovereignty vessels in a position that, if we were the kind of species that wanted leverage over the sovereignty, would be quite valuable to certain parties who have had difficulties with your peripheral council agreements. We have a list of factions we could contact, if you'd like to see it. Through the suppression array you were kind enough to configure with a receiving channel. Vethal closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, she replayed the intelligence assessment from 8 months ago. Compensatory posturing. The consensus of 5 experienced analysts. She opened her eyes. I need to speak with my senior staff. Of course, we'll be here. What the senior staff said, in private, over the following 90 minutes, was not what Vethal recorded in the official log. The official log noted strategic consultation. What actually happened in the sealed command chamber of the eternal premise was something closer to a collective reckoning. Marin 6 kept returning to the fake anchor, to the fact that it had been built before the sovereignty arrived, to precise specifications, using intelligence the sovereignty had no explanation for. They knew our equipment catalog, not generally, specifically. Serial tolerances, frequency harmonics, the specific encoding our anchors use for adjacent tanker handshakes. They had a source, Dosick said. Inside the sovereignty, Marin 6 asked. They reverse-engineered from a previous encounter. He pulled his data slate. This is what I can't resolve. The earliest date on which any sovereignty vessel came close enough to human-occupied space for detailed technical surveillance, even with hypothetical sensor technology beyond our estimates, was 14 months ago. The modifications they made to our network required design work. The design work required complete specifications. The specifications had to exist before the design work. Which means they started before they could have had the data, Marin 6 finished. Unless, Dosick said quietly, they started from something else, not from our specifications. From what? From a prediction, a reverse engineering of what our equipment would be, based on, he stopped. Based on what? Based on first principles, based on how we think. He set the slate down. They didn't steal our schematics. They figured out what we would build because they understood how we solve problems, and then they built the counter to it. The silence in the sealed chamber was different from all the previous silences. It had a quality that, in sovereignty culture, corresponded to the moment in a military engagement when the tactical model becomes inadequate, when you realize the situation requires not adjustment but replacement. Vethal said, they planned for an enemy they'd never met by modeling how that enemy would think. And they were right, Dosick said. Not perfectly, Marin 6 added. 2 of their outer system stations were destroyed by our probe sweeps before they went active. They lost those. They had accounted for those losses, Dosick said. The formation still functioned without them. They built in redundancy. Vethal stood up. She walked to the sealed chamber's viewport, a narrow rectangle of stars that looked, from the inside of an invisible cage, exactly like they had always looked, exactly like freedom. How many personnel did they lose? She asked. The question confused her officers. It wasn't the question they expected. We don't know, Marin 6 said. The outer system stations if they were crewed. Find out. It took 3 hours, because finding out required asking the humans directly, and asking required acknowledging that the information mattered, and acknowledging that the information mattered was its own kind of signal. The human spokesperson, her name, which she eventually offered, was Coordinator Assel Varga, and she provided it in the same tone she provided all information, as though names were simply data and data was simply data, confirmed that the outer system stations had been crewed. They had not been evacuated before the Sovereignty probe sweeps reached them, because evacuating them would have left sensor signatures that would have revealed the station's existence. They had been crewed by volunteers. 11 people. They chose to stay, Varga said. They understood what would happen when your probes reached them. Vethal did not immediately respond. The word volunteer was familiar in the context of military service. It was not familiar in the context of knowing your exact position will be sterilized by an enemy probe sweep and choosing to remain there anyway in order to avoid revealing a strategic deception. Why, she said finally, and was surprised by how the question came out not tactical, not strategic, but something simpler and harder to answer than either. Why would they choose that? Varga's answer was quiet, not sad, not proud. The temperature of it was different from everything before, warmer somehow, in a way that did not make it easier to hear. Because they understood what we were building, and they believed it was worth it. 11 people believed a diplomatic leverage operation was worth dying for. 11 people believed that the next 100 years of what happens to humanity was worth it. You have to understand, and here Varga paused, and when she continued, something in the structure of her sentences changed, became less diplomatic, more direct. We've watched what happens to the species your sovereignty integrates. We have 70 years of those records. We know what integration means in practice. Those 11 people didn't die for a negotiation. They died so that we could have one, so that it would be a real one. That's different. Vethal sat with this for a long time. What Varga was describing was not a calculation. It was not strategy in any form the sovereignty recognized, which prized efficiency, minimum cost for maximum outcome, the rational allocation of acceptable losses. What she was describing was the willingness of 11 people to accept certain death for an outcome they would never see secured, because they believed in its importance beyond their own existence in it. Dosick, reading her expression, said quietly, "That's not the first time they did something like that. The whole plan, everything we've seen, required the people who built it early on to accept that they might not live to see it work." Marinsik said, "And they did it anyway." "Yes," Vethal said. She stood up. She went back to the main command deck. She opened the channel. "Coordinator Varga. Fleet Commander. I want to understand something and I want you to answer directly." She paused. "The 11 people in the outer system stations, they knew your plan might not work. The whole operation, it was dependent on assumptions about how we would deploy, what equipment we would use. If we had deployed differently, chosen different anchor positions, used different probe patterns, your entire architecture fails." "Yes." "And they still." "Yes." Vethal said, "I am trying to understand why that did not paralyze your planning." The pause was not long. It felt like Varga had been waiting for this question for a long time, maybe longer than the operation itself. "Because we're not rational, Fleet Commander." Vethal was very still. "Not in the way your models expect. You planned against a species that would make optimal decisions under pressure. We don't do that. We knew we might be wrong about your deployment. We built the plan anyway. We staffed it anyway. We knew that 11 specific people might die because of an assumption that turned out to be incorrect. They knew it too. They went anyway. A breath. You cannot model an enemy that will accept catastrophic loss for a non-guaranteed outcome. Your intelligence framework doesn't have a column for it, and that's not a weakness we have. That's the most dangerous thing about us. We will take the loss. We will take it and we will keep building." The command deck of the Asterisk Eternal premise was very quiet. Marin 6 was not looking at her console. Dosick had stopped writing in his log. Vethal said, "What are your terms?" The negotiation lasted 9 days. In the sovereignty's history of integration negotiations, this was almost 3 times the previous record. The humans did not ask for the peripheral council seat. They asked for a different kind of seat, one with veto capacity on integration, offers to species within 40 light-years of Sol. They asked for the same class of intelligence sharing that sovereignty member states received, rather than the monitored, filtered version offered to integrated species. They asked for full FTL communication rights, unmonitored with external parties. They asked for sovereignty, not independence within the sovereignty's framework, sovereignty itself. Vethal relayed each demand to the Sovereignty High Council. The Council's initial responses ranged from dismissal to outrage, which was expected. What changed the Council's position was not argument and not pressure. It was Dosick's final report, compiled during the negotiation period, which the Sovereignty's High Council received on the 6th day and which contained 3 sections. The first section documented the technical analysis of the modified anchor network, including the Sovereignty's best estimate of how long it would have taken Sovereignty engineers to design the same modifications, given the same intelligence. The estimate was 19 years. The second section documented the 11 volunteers. The third section, the one that changed the vote, was simply titled Projection. It modeled humanity's development trajectory over the next 2 centuries, given the current rate of adaptation, applied creativity, and institutional willingness to accept loss for strategic goals. The model had significant uncertainty ranges. The lower bound of the range was alarming. The upper bound was something Dosick had never put in a report before. He included it because he had checked it 4 times, and it kept coming out the same way. The Council approved the terms on the 9th day. The gravity anchor network was released. The 47 vessels withdrew to the system boundary. Vethal was the last to leave. She waited until the formation had cleared the heliopause before opening the channel one final time. She did not know what she intended to say. She knew only that leaving without saying it seemed like a different kind of mistake than all the others. Coordinator Varga. Fleet Commander Vethal. The 11 people, what were their names? A long pause, not calculated, not diplomatic, the pause of someone deciding whether to give a stranger something real. Varga gave her the names, all 11, one by one in the order they had agreed to stay. Vethal recorded them in her personal log, not the official record, her own. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for asking," Varga said, and then quieter in a tone that had nothing of the climatically calm left in it. "They knew you might never know they existed. That was part of what they agreed to. They went anyway." The channel closed. Vethal sat in the silence of the command deck and looked at the stars where Earth's system had been, already receding in the tactical display. She thought about the Sovereignty's intelligence category for compensatory posturing. She thought about the moment she had told Dosick that 1.7 standard deviations wasn't alarming. She thought about the High Council's vote and Dosick's report, and the upper bound of the projection that he had checked 4 times before including it. She had read that projection 3 times herself. She had not discussed it with her officers because she did not know what it meant to discuss it, whether it was a military matter, a political matter, or something else entirely, something that required a category that didn't exist yet. The projection modeled what humanity would look like in 200 years if it continued doing exactly what it was already doing. Not faster ships, not better weapons, not any of the things that made a civilization powerful in the Sovereignty's framework. Just this, the willingness to continue past the point where continuation made sense, past the point of guaranteed loss, past the point where 11 people knew they would not survive and agreed to that and showed up anyway. Compounded, scaled, extended across 2 centuries of whatever humans decided mattered to them. The model's upper bound had no sovereignty equivalent, not because the mathematics was incorrect, but because the mathematics described something that had never before been required to be described, a civilization that had quantifiably no stopping point. No terminal condition the sovereignty could identify or reliably create that would cause humanity to decide the cost exceeded the goal. Dosick had written, in the margin of the projection. In a notation style he reserved for observations that resisted formal categorization. The question is not whether humanity is the most powerful civilization we have encountered. They are not. The question is, what is the appropriate posture toward a civilization that simply does not stop? He had not answered it. He hadn't answered it because the answer required knowing something about humanity that 11 dead people in the outer dark had already known about themselves. That some things are worth the cost you cannot yet calculate. That you build anyway. That you stay. The stars moved across the viewport as the asterisk eternal premise accelerated away, and Vethal did not watch them. She was reading 11 names in her personal log, in the order they had agreed to stay in the outer dark, where no one had been watching. She was understanding, at last, what the sovereignty's models had never had a column for. The galaxy's strongest civilizations measured their power in what they could destroy. Humanity had done something different and stranger, and in the long arithmetic of centuries far more dangerous. It had measured its power in what it was willing to lose. And it had never, not once, in any engagement, in any negotiation, in any crisis the sovereignty had manufactured to test its limits, it had never once found that limit. The names stayed in her log for the rest of her career. She never removed them. She never fully explained why. She suspected on the